right, everyone. Looks like I think most people seem to be coming through that door. Just a couple more stragglers. Plenty of room up front still. There's plenty of heaps of seats over here anyway. But we might as well get this thing started because I tend to talk quickly and I got a lot to go through, I hope. Anyway, so hello, everyone. Good to see that everyone's probably got their caffeine going and everything for the morning. My name is Mikey, and I'm the 3D artist that worked on DREDGE. And today I'm going to be talking about how we went about creating an eerie atmosphere for our quote-unquote cozy fishing adventure game, DREDGE. So for those of you who don't know what DREDGE is, got a little trailer here for you guys, and I'm just going to change the lighting just a little bit here, because it's kind of cool. Video time. Ooh. Everyone loves a good video audio presentation.
Rated E10 for ages 10 and up.
Extra bonus glitchy effects on that one.
Rated.
All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just talk about what I'm going to be trying to cover in this talk. So we're going to be talking about the art style and how we went about creating the game and the art style for it. The importance of juxtaposition within our game, which is one of the key things we were trying to achieve with things. How we created a sense of calm, how we tried to make the game more unsettling rather than horror, and then complementing our art with the gameplay involved. Bit of a disclaimer, this talk covers things that worked really well for us on our particular project. They're not necessarily the most optimized way of doing things, but they just worked out perfectly for what we needed. And so hopefully you might be able to come away and take some cool ideas and stuff away from this talk. So, who am I? So, I'm Michael Bastiaens, one commonly known as just Mikey to most people outside of my own family. I'm the 3D artist at Black Silk Games, and I am like a true 3D generalist. So, my main roles on DREDGE was mainly the modeling, the texturing, the animations, a little bit of tech art here and there. And because all of us at our studio, of 4 of us, we're all gamers, so we all contributed quite heavily to the game design, and especially with a small team, we're really heavily involved with a lot of that sort of stuff. So I've been in the industry for over a decade now, at a couple studios and also teaching, and I've predominantly been working on work-for-hire projects. So those are things working for like larger entertainment companies like Disney and whatnot. But yeah, so it's been pretty cool doing that. So, speaking of that team of 4, a bit of a shout out to the other people that were on my team. So we have Nadi, who's actually here today in the crowd there as well. We have Alex Ritchie, who was our art director and artist. He was the one that pretty much came up with most of the art style in this project. We have Joel, who was our programmer and writer, and then me, who was the latest member of the team that came a little bit after things had just gotten started. So, a bit about Black Silk Games. So even though this is our first game that we've worked on, we've all been working together for about a decade at a previous company, and we've worked on a range of different experiences on multiple different platforms, but predominantly mobile. But then, because a lot of things were mobile or in parks and stuff like that, COVID gave us a reason to kind of break away from our previous company of work for hire and create our own OIP project, which was something that we've always wanted to do. And then so yeah, DREDGE is our first game. So, creating the game and the art style. So we often get complimented about how great the art is in this game, which is super flattering, but how do we actually go about designing the game and developing that art style? So first up is about how we actually came up with the idea of DREDGE. So first, what we did was we prototyped a bunch of different ideas for different games. So we had about 5 to 6 different prototypes, and these prototypes had very short turnarounds. We're like talking a couple of weeks to try and get something up and running, and then try to get them in front of players just to validate whether or not they might be actually any interesting to people. In fact, the elevator pitch for DREDGE was simply Lovecraftian fishing. So for any of the artists out there, just that idea alone is like, I'm sold. That just sounds pretty damn good anyway. I don't care about what the gameplay was. In fact, the actual gameplay was a little bit different when it was originally pitched to us. It was actually pitched as kind of like a turn-based sort of game. And then when we tried things out, it was like, you know what? This is probably going to be better just like as a real-time third-person sort of game. But with these prototypes, our main focus was finding and fine-tuning that core gameplay mechanic and getting a rough idea of that art style. And then, so yeah, we did lots of playtesting rounds with a number of different players, which happened to just be right next door to us at our previous studio, which was kind of helpful. And as a developer, one of the important things is that you can often like tunnel vision into your own game. So getting those outside ideas from other opinions of other people is just really important to get your game out there and just getting some ideas on it. So, choosing a direction for the art style. So the most important thing was just kind of knowing the restrictions, knowing our limits, knowing what we don't know, and knowing our deadlines. Because we had an idea of how long we want to spend in the game, we kind of had to have a good understanding of what can we actually do within that time frame, and what skills do we actually have to actually create this thing. Because there's no point in trying to make a epic AAA looking game when you've only got 2 years and one artist. It's just not feasible and everything like that as well. So we knew what our strengths were, and we knew what we would be capable of delivering, or at least have a good idea of figuring it out. And if we scoped something out and was a little bit off track, then we had an awesome producer that would kind of just like get us back on track every now and then. So getting things up quickly. So this is one of the key things that was pretty much a big part of our kind of like ethos over at Black Sock Games. And then that's just trying to get things into the game and testing things out as quickly as possible. So a lot of the visual design of our early development in DREDGE just happened at the same time we were prototyping, and there was very little traditional sort of concept art being done during this prototype phase. When you only have a small team, you're pretty much trying to get everything out as quickly as possible. So some of the reasons why we didn't do a normal traditional concept art phase was it just simply wasn't enough time to actually concept out everything. It was just easier to iterate as we went, and it's just also easier to experience the things that we're chucking into the game in context directly in the engine. I actually have a bit of a hot take when it comes to concept art, and a lot of people seem to confuse like character illustration work with concept art. The idea of concept art is it's supposed to just generate ideas for you to kind of develop further. There's no point in spending a whole bunch of time doing this really elaborate character illustration when you've got a tight time frame and you're trying to get things going up and going really quickly. So a lot of the actual concept work that we ended up doing were essentially scribbles, which we never intended anyone to ever see. But there will be a couple of them that do end up popping up here, and I am ashamed of them to a certain degree, and I'm pretty sure Alex would hate me showing them off as well. But he's not here, and he didn't want to do a talk, so tough luck. So another thing was that we've got a lot of shader effects inside of DREDGE as well that kind of augment how the assets might actually appear in game. So one of the important things was to actually get them into the game, just seeing how things might actually look, and then making those sort of iterations afterwards, just in case. So, did we actually do any exploration into different art styles? And then, so yes, the answer is yes, we did do some explorations, but the main thing is that Alex, art director, already had a pretty good idea of the sort of direction he kind of wanted to go in. So he's got some really cool influences from games like Disco Elysium and Dishonored, which are some of his favorite games, and then some of that kind of shines through in his art. And it's always pretty slick to look at. So even though the game has a bit of this low poly feel, it's more along the lines of a simple and clean kind of art style more than anything else, because even though the models kind of look low poly, they aren't even that low, because we had to do a lot of weird stuff to make the textures look cool, which was kind of like putting in the actual geometry into things to make things look really sharp and clean, which you can't usually get with the textures, but I'll go into that a little bit later. So we also knew that we wanted to have that 2D style really show itself off. but we had to kind of reserve those for where we had time for, so we spent that sort of work on the character portraits. So all the character portraits in the game, they got this really lovely illustrative style to it, but they also take time, and we had very tight time frames to kind of get things done, so we used those things sparingly. And then we found that the combination of the 2D art and the simple 3D assets created like a surprisingly effective and charming art style that worked really well for us. And with this whole idea of juxtaposition, which we ended up using within the game quite a bit, it just fit the game so well. So, creating the characters, and we've even got some of those early sketches that Alex did there as well, which are some of the nicer ones, especially compared to some of the other things that we kind of did. So, a big part of finding the overall art style of the game was trying to figure out what the main character was going to be as well. But technically, the main character in the game itself is basically your boat. But we did want to have a bit of a representation of the character, especially when we started finding out that we actually need to put a bit more work into our story within the game. Originally, there wasn't that much of a storyline, and it was kind of like spattered about here and there. But then we realized that people were enjoying the little stories that started popping up within the game, and then we're like, oh, maybe we should develop the story a little bit more. Let's do a little bit more. Let's do a little bit more. And then it was like, we need to have a character that's represented by a 2D art piece. And then we had to do some cutscene work as well, so we ended up spending a little bit of time putting that stuff in there. But one of the really interesting things was like the rest of the other characters within the game. So most of the people in this lonely world, they're all kind of like slightly uneasy to look at. They're all a little bit weird, a little bit like, no one's really that happy to be in this world. Everyone's despondent and consigned to their fate for the most part. In fact, here are some of those characters. So everyone's favorite fishmonger, even like the jolly looking, Mayor? We did quite a bit of work around his eyes just to make him look a little bit creepier every time, until you go too far and then, no, that's too creepy, that's too creepy. Pull it back, pull it back, pull it back. But speaking of the characters, here is a little video provided by Alex, which he probably doesn't know that I am showing. So this is just a video about how we went about creating the fishmonger. So that was pretty much one of the early sketches and concept things that he kind of does. So he uses Krita to do most of the 2D artwork in the game, and just because he is familiar with that tool, and he loves the kind of lasso fill tool that's within Krita, because he tends to paint things in shapes more than anything else. He does very little line work, and then everything is basically just pretty much drawing shapes and then filling in those shapes with colors and then cutting things out, adding things back in, which allowed him to create a lot of those sort of like sharp, jagged edges and squared edges. So it's always pretty interesting when you talk to people like, oh, how did you go about doing that art? Did you paint everything in? And he's like, I don't really paint, I just draw shapes. Which is always pretty crazy when you see him doing it, because he does it really damn fast, and like, I don't know what you're doing, man. And then you try to copy his art style by painting it in. Like when I was trying to do like some of the 3D models and doing that texture work, I was just like, I need to find another way of doing this. And I actually ended up doing some of the texture work by literally lassoing the 3D model itself and then like assigning those chunks of the faces just to different swatches on the actual texture sheets. Yeah, here's him doing some more eye work and everything as well, just making things a little bit smaller, a little bit weirder. Even in the end, not all the characters even had a background plate behind them as well, just because it was just like, oh, these take a little bit of time. We don't have that much time. And also it just kind of made some of the kind of more key characters just a little bit more special as well. The final asset also had a little animated fly that flies around the fish. And then when we were at a place at Gamescom in Germany, we just thought there was an actual fly in the room. I think the amount of times I was just trying to swipe it off the screen, like, oh, that's right, it's an animated fly. Yeah, and it's just that easy. Yeah, that's the annoying thing when you sit next to him and watch him do stuff. It's just like, damn it, Alex, it's not fair. So the other important thing within our game was the fish. So we have over 125 fish. Now we've got some more like free updates and some DLC coming through. So there's even more than that now. But the interesting thing is all of those fish are based on actual real world fish. But also within the game, there's when things get a little bit spooky, we've actually got things that we just call the aberrated fish. And these are sort of like the Lovecraftian twisted, like malformed sort of versions of those fish. So here are a couple of those ones there. I am actually quite fond of that gnashing perch in that bottom corner. But one of the things that really makes it kind of cool is like we just decided to give things slightly human features onto those fish, and that just made things super creepy. And as well as we had a bunch of other ideas, and it was just going as wild and as crazy as we could. Like, why don't we put a black hole in the middle of that fish's head? And he was just like, yeah, all right then, let's see how that goes. Because I think there were a couple of times where he just literally just ran out of ideas. It's like, I've done the lightning thing, I've done the fire thing, I've done the ice thing. What else can I do? I'm out of ideas. And that's good when you can just bounce ideas off each other and try to get those sort of things and just start scribbling away. When we got towards the end of the project, when he was literally out of ideas, we were actually able to speed up the process quite a bit by just kind of like, I like that fin from that fish, and just literally almost kit bashing the 2D art and slapping those on just to make our process quicker for creating some of those fish. So creating the fish, again, here is another thing which this one he actually intended people to see. So he probably spent a little bit of work on this one, just a smidge. So this is one of the conger eels within the game. And as you can see, there is like this kind of grid behind it. So all of the fish, they're all different sizes, and they all had to fit within a sort of grid shape. In this case, it was like this L thing, which also made designing some fish kind of interesting, especially when our program would say, I want this fish and it has to fit into this shape. And you look at that and go, that doesn't seem like it's going to work. And then so you're just making like the most weird positioned fish and sharks, just trying to fit them in there. But again, he spends a very little time actually just doing the actual sketch work, and then pretty much just starts doing the same thing again with a lot of just blocking out the silhouette and the shapes, and then adding on a lot of the kind of like shadows and details afterwards. And this made things easy for me because it just gave me an idea of how I would approach some of the 3D things as well. Just like, oh, it's actually a pretty simple approach to things. We very rarely use gradients within the game, so everything is just solid blocks of colors and shapes. So, I've mentioned this word a few times, but why was the importance of juxtapositions just that important to Dredge? Well, the game is fundamentally broken into juxtapositions as a whole, whether it be in gameplay or visual design. So some of those examples are the ideas of like night versus day. We have this idea of like open versus closed. So the idea of like during the day, you're just seeing lots of like these open vistas, and then at night, those same vistas kind of become very claustrophobic once the fog kind of comes in. We have this whole idea of the normal versus abnormal, and we have ideas of like simple versus complex shapes, and then calming versus stressful. And as you can see, here are some of those sort of like different variations of those fish. So we have the cod, and then its aberrated version, or one of those versions as well. Then we have that conger eel that was just there previously, as well as its aberrated version. And then we have the mackerel, and one of the very first sort of aberrations that we did, which was the lumpy mackerel. Yeah, I think we also had a lot of fun naming things as well within the game and coming up with weird descriptions, and then I feel sorry for localization teams who had to try and describe those in their own languages. So, creating a cozy atmosphere. So the first thing we wanted to do was make sure that vistas and everything were open and vibrant during the day. There's actually very few bad things that can happen to you during the day as well. We try to keep things really calm and tranquil. And we didn't actually plan on people being drawn into the calm and peaceful world as much as we did, which was a really good surprise for us and really helpful for us as far as gameplay went going forwards. In fact, I would often just run the project in the background and just listen to the ambient sounds and everything like that. Cheers, sound designers. And that just made things really good, just having that water in the background, and I didn't fall asleep all the time. So speaking of that world, here is a nice little video of some of the different areas within the world. So the first area is the Marrows. So this area is pretty much like our starting zone. It's where we introduce the player to all the different sort of mechanics within the game. This opening area is like very smooth. There's nothing that can really come into the bay that much, and there's a couple down. Lots of early quests and stuff like that are here to just drive you through the game. Another interesting fact is you can see this lighthouse from anywhere in the game, because at night you can get kind of like disorientated, so we made it so that, okay, you can always find your way back home. This next area is Gale Cliffs, and as you can see, it's a lot different from that previous area. It's basically a lot of tall cliffs, howling winds, and then around the back there's a whole bunch of sunken pirate ships. And there's a whole bunch of things you can kind of find out back there. And this area also has two towns. One is this ruined settlement, and then the other area is an old whaling station town. And it was really cool finding references for those things around the world, because abandoned things are always pretty cool. This next area is Stellar Basin. This is like our tropical world. So one of the main features of this place is its ruined resort. We had like lots of tropical trees. There are these weird animals there that aren't monkeys. They're actually kookaburras, but that's a whole other thing in itself. So we've got lots of like the seaweed and everything that's there. And also there was a little smaller island over here as well, which is a giant castle fort that's been repurposed by one of the characters and to be turned into a bit of a research facility, and you do quests for them. The other key thing about this area is that at night there's a lot of the bioluminescent sort of stuff. So everything starts glowing and everything, like especially with all like the different seaweed and coral. And then there's also some other kind of creatures around there as well that also tend to glow, like the jellyfish. And then there's also something, this giant hole in the middle. You'll have to play to figure out what that is. We've also got a couple other zones. So this next zone is Twisted Strand, which is our mandatory swamp level. This area is very mazy. It's very hard to kind of navigate your way around. There'll be vines that kind of trap you in there as well. There's some crazy people in that forest and stuff as well as these gigantic traps, but it's kind of a little bit tricky to see within that dark sort of stuff. And then the final area is the mandatory volcano level, everyone's favorite sort of final zone. Although you can go to any of these zones in any order, we do try to steer people in a particular direction, but nothing is stopping you from going into the final zone right at the start. But then you start hearing these creepy monsters and you're like, yeah, maybe I will go back and do that second zone first. So, the unsettling nighttime. So, like I said, one of the juxtapositions of the daytime is that night. So, what we really want to do within this game is to create a sense of like loneliness whenever you're out there at night. Even during the day, it's like it's just you, and it's kind of peaceful because it's just you. But when it's just you and it's dark and you can't really see anything, and that kind of makes things a little bit creepy and scary. And one of the main things we want to do is just try to make the game more unsettling, more than actual true horror. And we want to kind of leave things to the player's imagination more than anything else, because it just felt like people come up with the weirdest conjurations in their own mind before we even introduce any of the monsters or any of the scary events. In fact, once you actually start seeing the monsters themselves, it's like it kind of loses that impact. So we had to kind of do a lot of things to try and keep those experiences fresh, or kind of put a twist on them so you think you might be experiencing one thing, and then eventually you would get something a little bit more different after that. So, the whole idea of taking 2D into 3D. So how did we do this? So obviously one of the key things around like the whole visual design and like one of our kind of like art pillars was this whole idea of sharp and clear shapes. And like I mentioned earlier, we did not want to use any gradients wherever possible. We did use them in some areas just to add a little bit of variation, but we tried to keep things as solid as we could. And as you can see by some of the geometry on that particular thing here, there's a lot of like chunks and stuff like that feels like that seems like unnecessary geometry. But they all added to kind of like adding slight variations in the color so that when you are up close to things, there aren't any blurry textures. Because originally when you were going past this gigantic ship, because most of our textures are very small, some are like 16 by 16 and it's just a bunch of different squares, you do notice that blurriness and everything as well. So we wanted to make sure that we just kept everything sharp and clear, because our textures were literally just a bunch of colored squares. Yeah, so each biome pretty much had its own texture sheet as well, and this was basically the whole idea of like, you'd have one corner which is basically just, here are a bunch of different color swatches, and it's different colors of like grays and browns and blues and reds. And then in the bottom corners, you might have something like, this is for where things glow. Here's a monster texture. It's just a gigantic eyeball. So it kind of looks really weird when you see these texture sheets. It's like this, it's just giant eyeball texture. But that was because the eyeball was the only thing that you would ever come close to and that needed that sort of kind of like clearness to it. And then of course we had some of those 3D limitations, and then so we had to try and reuse as many textures as possible, because we developed for PC and Switch. So we picked the highest end device and then the lowest end device, because in that way we assumed that once it goes to like the PlayStation and the Xbox side of things, it should all kind of work smoothly, and for the most part it kind of did, which was kind of handy for us. And then obviously there is a bit of a trade-off when you are adding more geometry, and especially with the way that we set up the UV shells, it does add more draw calls to it. But we felt that it was kind of more important to keep true to the general aesthetic of things and then take a very minuscule hit on performance when there were other things that would tank performance a lot more, like water or everything else. So that was a happy sacrifice that we're willing to make. So creating calm. So part of the key things around creating a cozy game was this whole sense of calmness. With the majority of the game, we intended people to be experiencing the game pretty much during the day. We needed people to just kind of get relaxed and immersed in our world more than anything else in order to lure them into staying out a little bit longer than expected. So how do we go about doing this? So on the right-hand side, we can just see one of the early levels that we kind of had for, this was pretty much some of that prototype art that we had right at the very start. And what we would usually do is we would start up with designing the different zones by scribbling on a whiteboard or putting things over on like a Google presentation and just having our Alex artist just pretty much open up Creator and just scribble things out. And we would try to figure out what do we want the player to do? What do we want them to find? How open do we want this space? How tight do we want to have this space? How many times do we want them to loop around the place? Where do we want to place things? And so we'll do a lot of that work on scribbles and then try to quickly just chuck them out onto the actual world and level. And then so what we would start doing is just using some of the unique tools to pretty much just like build up some terrain models. And then we had a triplanar shader that kind of detects like the angle and height of different things. So it automatically detects, oh, this feels like a cliff. This is getting pretty high. This might have some snow on it. But when you use this approach, it actually takes up quite a bit of performance. So what we ended up having to do was pretty much export these assets out and then just put them into Blender or Maya and then pretty much export them out as their own individual FBXs. It also allowed us to customize things and control things just a little bit more inside of those different applications. We did use Blender and Maya as well because other artists, he's more familiar with Blender, and I've just had a lot more experience with Maya, and we just like, well, we might as well just use what we're comfortable with for the time being anyway. So the other important thing was creating the sky. So obviously the default clouds in Unity, they're all nice, fluffy and billowy, and they're all kind of nice and everything like that, but it didn't fit within the style of our game. Like I said, one of our art pillars was this whole idea of like simple, sharp, and clean shapes. So we had to try and figure out a way of creating these weird sort of clouds and everything as well. So as you can see over here, they are still pretty sharp and jagged and everything as well. We also want to control a lot of these sort of things within like the editor as well. So we've got a lot of controls that can control like how big those clouds are, how much they tile and everything as well, just to fine tune things to exactly what we were after. And one of the other key things was the importance of that starting scene. So when you're creating a game, there's that whole adage of you really have a few minutes to really capture the attention of players. And one of the first things that we have was this kind of really cool scene of the first time you actually undock and then move out towards this next town. And we just really wanted to make sure people experience that sunset, have a bit of that, the water reflections, and then the sky. And it just adds into, and you just start getting immersed into that world straight away, which was really important to us. So the next thing is the water and the joy of water. So obviously being a boat game, it is the biggest part of the game. And we had a lot of technical issues and some joy trying to get the water working. This is one of the original sort of water things that we had going on the game. It's pretty much using some of the standard sort of water Unity things and adding some other stuff there. But obviously it wasn't quite stylized enough to what we were kind of after. We did try doing a number of other things, like the traditional Gersner waves, which are the kind of like the sharper, steeper waves. But the problem with those realistic waves is that those waves start turning into kind of like peaked ramps. And when your boat starts moving pretty quickly, those ramps aren't quite ideal for boats. And then so we ended up with the boat flying all over the place. And then when your boat starts flying over the place, you tend to end up upside down some of the times. So we ended up just going with the sine wave approach, which worked perfectly for us. It achieved all the sort of gameplay things, didn't really detract from the gameplay experience very much at all, so we just relied on going with that more than anything else. We also wanted to make sure that we could control the water visibility and density. So in different zones, you can see less and less. For example, in Twisted Strand, that tropical area, you can see really deep down into the water. Whereas in our swamp zone, you can barely see under the surface. And we want to have that direct control within our own particular shader, as well as being able to change up the water color within the different zones. So speaking of said water shader, this gigantic spaghetti mess is pretty much what we created for the water shader. So it has a lot of things that control where the water foam is, how to kind of like bind things together, how all the different sort of like colors and effects and then visibility, reflection, refraction sort of stuff happens all in this crazy shader. There are probably some more optimized things we could have done, but we end up trimming it quite a bit to make sure that it works on all the platforms. But in the end, it was just a case of this is working working. It's doing exactly what we need. We could fine tune it more, but it's doing what we need. So let's just go with it for now. So basically a lot of the performance issues that we ended up taking was basically once we decided to add in like reflections, because you're essentially adding in another camera into the scene to get that to work. So on the Switch, we actually ended up just capping the performance because it was always just at 59 and not quite 60. And we're like, let's just do this sort of thing. And then it's still an awesome sort of game, and it looks fine. We didn't feel like you lost anything for doing that. And then so as for the water, here are some of the examples of how that water ended up looking. So as you can see, we've still maintained like the sharp and clear shapes. There's still like very few gradients as well. These are the sine waves doing its thing, and the clouds all kind of changing from the dark and stormy to pretty much transitioning to disappearing and just turning into calmer seas. So another important thing about creating the water was our awesome wave mask texture. So this is like a multi-channel texture, so there was different things on the red channel, green channel, blue channel that all controlled different gameplay elements. So even though it looks kind of crazy pink and purple and blue, it was actually one of the most important textures that we had. It's also like the biggest texture that we had in the game. So this would control things like the island coastline foam, because around each of the islands we wanted to make sure that there was always going to be some of those ripples that kind of work and how we wanted them to radiate out from the object. We also had a lot of things that this contains a lot of information about the depth of different areas of the game as well. So a lot of things within the game are like depth checks to see whether or not you can spawn a gigantic monster within this area or not, so it doesn't spawn up in certain areas. We also had areas that were always going to be flat water, like that starting zone. You never really get any big waves in there. It's always flat and smooth sailing. So we wanted to have some control over that sort of area, because we also noticed that if you've got lots of waves, especially where you're docked, you kind of get bounced around just a little bit on the boat. And then I still remember when we left it overnight and then the boat would bounce pretty high, or otherwise just get pulled out to sea. It was kind of realistic. It was kind of funny, but not exactly what we were after within the game. So the other important thing was just creating some of the little bits of polish in the environmental ambience. So effects really do add quite a lot to the world. So things just like that, our stylized sort of wind streaks and everything like that, again, they're just really sharp little solid shapes that just kind of wisp on past. We've got everyone's favorite just random dust modes that don't really make sense, but for some reason they just look really pretty anyway, so why not put them in? And then we've got the whole idea of like weather triggers when you kind of enter different zones, just to kind of continue to immerse players into these different areas and stuff as well. When we realized people liked exploring the game, we also ended up deciding to add in a little bit of additional wildlife as well. When we added photo mode, it was like, all right, cool. Now you can actually take photos of all these other kind of nice, peaceful events rather than just all the scary events as well. This was one of the few times where I was able to get away with just a little bit of scope creep. I had a free weekend and I felt like doing a bunch of animals that may or may not have going to make it into the game. And we managed to get them in. I do feel sorry for our other programmer, Joel, who just had to try and cram them all in at the last minute. But I think it worked out pretty good and I had a bit of fun with it as well. So populating the world. So Dredge is a very lonely sort of game as well. So if anything, we also want to just create small pockets of civilization. And this was just done thematically, but also again, it just made it easier for us. So we didn't have to create too many additional characters. So just the less people in the world, the less sort of like quest lines and character portraits that we needed to kind of add into the game. So everything feels a little bit lonely, out of the way. We drew from real world locations. So whether it be like some of the abandoned whaling stations or some of the kind of like fjords in Norway and everything like that, even from New Zealand areas. We used a lot of those sort of things just as reference to kind of get the ball rolling. There are very few living character assets in the game as well, like as far as like human sort of looking characters. We've got like these sort of like cultists that are there as well. They're pretty much the only sort of like human looking character in the game that's actually modeled out, and the other only animated sort of character that you see is that dog at the bottom corner if you can find him. So the other key thing was this whole idea of making things unsettling rather than true horror. So none of us at Black Soul Games are like real horror gamers. We prefer like the eerie sort of atmospheres and something a little bit spooky, but we're not big on the whole jump scare thing anyway. So what were the things that were key to kind of making things just a little bit eerie in Dredge? So first and foremost, it's the fog. The fog does quite a lot, especially early on when you don't have enough lights and everything like that. It really is quite limiting to see how far you're going. And if you've gone up too far offshore from that starting area, you can get lost pretty easily. So one of the interesting things was setting up this fog shader. So the default Unity fog shader, it's quite limiting in what we could do, and we needed to make sure that that fog was centered around the player and not the camera. So we had to do a whole bunch of other things with all of our materials to kind of allow this sort of fade off effect to kind of work. So basically this whole shader chunk of the shader is pretty much in every single material. It's always checking like, all right, there's this whole fog thing, and so we always have to take that into account. The next thing we're going to talk about is creating some of the monsters in this game. So each of the different biomes, so we've got 5 biomes currently, each biome has its own monster, and they're all sort of based off real creatures, but then kind of had a bit of a twist on each of those. So once again, most monsters are like most impactful before you realize what they are. Once you've seen it a few times, they kind of lose their impact, so we had to kind of slowly introduce the player to these things as you go. So at the very start of the game, you are unlikely to encounter all the big scary things. It's as you progress through the game that you start finding some of the more scarier creatures. We felt that the longer we can keep things unknown or unpredictable, the better. But we could only do so much with the time that we kind of had. We all had so many ideas for so many other monsters, but it was just like, oh, but we can't really add that in right now. And then it worked out pretty well for us because like a lot of things in Dredge, like including the storyline, the more things that we keep vague, the better. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit about the design process of what we did for the Gale Cliff Monster, which is one of the creatures in our second zone. So like I said, what we would usually do is start off by scribbling up on a whiteboard, like this is the zone. We have an idea for this monster that's going to pretty much patrol through the narrow sort of passageways there. Sometimes some of the creature and monster designs that were either based off an actual creature or character design that we thought, I really want to have this kind of creature do something. Or in other areas, it was kind of like a gameplay interaction that we were kind of after. So in one area, we were like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if there would be like these smaller things that kind of swarm your boat? And then we would develop that idea once we get things into the game. In this case, we just wanted to have like this giant eel-like creature kind of just exploring around. So the first thing I would do is just go through Google and then just type in giant eel monster and see what kind of pops up, and then just try to find some really cool ideas. And then just going wild with things like, what else is a weird looking creature that I can combine with things? So of course, mandatory axolotl, because I really wanted to get an axolotl into the game, and one day I will get an axolotl into the game. So here are some of my scribbles. Again, I didn't really intend anyone to see these things anyway, but here they all are in front of everyone. They made into the art book, and when we were actually making the art book, Alex and I were like, oh, I don't want to put that in there, but we need to put something in this art book. Like, oh, but everyone's going to see how bad they are. Like, ugh. Mandatory artist shame of their own work all the time, I guess, as it is. But as you can see, we just tried to like get a couple ideas of just weird sort of shapes and ideas, and then we would go like, all right, which of these ideas do you kind of like? I like that shape, but I like that head, or I like that tail, I like that fin. And then I would be like, okay, then I'll try to mishmash all this sort of stuff together again until we slightly get something closer to what we were after. The next thing we'd do is just try to make sure that the idea would actually be feasible. Because it's all great an idea to have like this cool idea, like it's going to do this, it's going to be awesome, we're going to put it in, and then when you actually put it into the game, it's like, oh, that's not going to work. Especially because we knew that there's going to be lots of tight passageways and everything and within this Gale Cliff zone, and the worst thing we wanted to do was actually just set this kind of like animation on rails, because we wanted it to be able to like double back, turn on itself, and actually chase the player rather than just be on its own little rail and just going around and not really caring about the player. So we knew that I didn't want to have to animate this entirely annoying like animation tree of how it might be able to turn. So we decided to go, all right, let's go with this whole bone follows bone in front approach to allow the tail to kind of like follow it wherever it kind of goes. And that seemed to work. And then this was literally grabbing one of our other monsters, and I just stuck it in my and just like, I'm just going to switch out the tail and put some edge loops around it, and then we're just going to see how that goes. So it was very quick to actually get that up and running. And then the next thing I would do would pretty much chuck that into ZBrush and just start sculpting things out. I like doing most of my 3D work directly in ZBrush and then only jumping back into Maya to pretty much retopologize things. I just find it just easier to get the shapes sorted out as quickly as possible. And then we'd do a couple more iterations, and then one of the things that we found out about this Gale Cliff monster was that originally the idea was it's blind and it can't see you, so it's just listening for your engine and everything like that, so it's easy to hide behind rocks and everything. But the problem was you couldn't see it very well, and then so it always hit you. We put a little bit of glow behind it, but it just wasn't enough. And so what we ended up doing was like saying, we need to give it an eyeball or something that glows. And then in the end, we decided to go with like a gigantic cyclopean eye that glows. And it actually turned into one of the coolest sort of things, especially when it comes out through one of the caves and then just like eye just opens up and go, oh, that looks spooky. And I can't really tell what it is because you can barely see under the water anyway. The next thing is this whole, the mirror monster. And I'm just going to talk about my own process about how I actually go about sculpting things, I guess, a little bit. So when we originally had the monster, we had like the prototype sort of creature, which was basically a glorified cylinder with a mouth. But the thing was, it was the right size. And then it was fitting well within the game. So I just pretty much picked that up, just dropped it quickly into ZBrush, and then just started blocking out the shapes and sticking things into it. It's just really easy for me to work when I am doing that and just pretty much just masking things out using this whole idea of like sharp shapes and angles and just slowly pulling things out there. Things like the fins, they were literally just like cubes and stuff. They just stuck on the side, stretched them out a little bit. And it's just easier for me personally to just work with the silhouette and shape within ZBrush rather than trying to polymodel that stuff anyway. It's really handy. What they've got in ZBrush is in the top left-hand corner. You can actually turn on that whole silhouette view and you can actually see the silhouette of your character that you're working on just a little bit more. And always trying to focus on like, well, this character is going to be seen predominantly from like a top-down angle. And I try and make sure that like that mouth is always kind of like facing up towards the camera that you're most likely going to be seeing it from. I'll skip through a little bit. Okay, video says let's not do that. That's fine. So obviously there are some monster limitations. So we had a lot of issues with like physics and collision and of course nav mesh fun. But one of the main things was just visibility within the different types of water. So we noticed that we had some really big creatures, but when they sit below the water, you just couldn't see them at all. So for this giant creature here, we've actually got a bit of a slider that refracts it and fakes its visibility. So I'm not actually moving this creature up and down. We are literally moving a slider that just kind of fakes the visibility of it so you can see a little bit more. That only applies to that particular creature, which worked out pretty good. And of course, some things just don't manage to make it into the game. So one of the characters that we had an idea for was in Stellar Basin before it turned into what it was like an octopus creature that kind of like swims around and then kind of like, you'd see all the bioluminescent sort of things and we're just kind of like, you just see black shapes coming towards you. But we realized, bioluminescent assets and glows is kind of tanking performance, so we had to reduce that. And then of course, this thing couldn't go into the shallow waters because it's got like this big bulbous head, so it's like, we can't do that either. But we were trying a whole bunch of different ideas with like, how can we do all these tentacle things? Can it grab the boat? What things can we do with just like, make the animation? Can we have it driven by just being able to move another target around? Do we just rely on physics? And then it just became a case of like, this is really complicated. Can we just change it and make it simpler? And then we changed it to what it is. And I actually liked the different version that we came up with. It worked out really cool. But we did want to have unique behaviors for each of the different monsters. So they're all slightly different in the way that they kind of worked. The next thing is this whole idea of complementing things with gameplay. So we want to make sure that we worked with the game as it is. So one of the key ideas was to try and lure people away from objectives that they were pretty much setting out for themselves. Because most gamers tend to be a bit like magpies anyway, like, ooh, shiny, ooh, shiny. And then the more that we could do that to a player, the more we could kind of train them into thinking one way and then giving them something else. So if anyone's played the game, you may have come across this guy, and that always gives people a bit of a shock. The other thing was this whole idea of working with the mini games. So we knew that we want to make the fishing game really super simple. And then the inventory thing is also super simple. And when you're doing these super simple things, eventually you're like focusing on that and like, this is easy. But you're not realizing that in the background, the monster's still around. And then so while you're focusing on just doing something nice and tranquil, that's when we kind of get you with the monster in the background. So what are some of the key takeaways? So first and foremost, these are what worked for DREDGE. And it just worked really well because of our small teams and the deadlines that we had, but they worked out perfectly fine for us. I think this whole idea of if the wrong thing stays in the game long enough, it becomes the right thing. And then that worked out really well for us anyway because it just worked and there wasn't really any need for us to continuously iterate upon the different asset. It was always going to be fine. And only we on our side would kind of know. And then the other thing was just figure out what kind of mood you want to get and understand your technical and timeline constraints. And to make sure you get things in early. I can't stress that enough. The sooner you can get things in and getting other people viewing it, the better. And of course, play test things and get people looking at things and getting the feedback from them. So, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Feel free at any time to just email me, whether it's just like, tell me more about Dredge or tell me more about that. I saw this one thing in that slide. Can you pretty much tell me a little bit more about that? I don't know. And I'll do what I can, or otherwise I'll just ask Alex and then reply for him anyway. You can follow Black Sock Games at Black Sock Games, or me at on Twitter as well. That being said, I am essentially just a giant retweet bot for the main Black Sock Games account anyway, but one of those days you never know, that may change. And if you do want to check out that QR code, that should link you guys straight to the game in case you are interested in seeing that. Thank you guys. All right, awesome. We've got maybe a few minutes for a couple questions, I do believe. So if there are any questions, yes, cool.
What was the size of the wave, the multi-wave, multi-channel texture? You said that was the largest one.
So what was the size of our wave mask texture? I do believe that was about 2048 by 2048. Okay. I think that was one of the largest sort of texture sizes that we were trying to gun for as far as like things on the Switch anyway. But I could be wrong, could have been 4096, but it's always being optimized back down to 2048.
Could you also put up the key takeaway slide again, really quickly?
Okay, yep, I should be able to hit that one back as well. There you go. Sweet, no worries. Any other questions? Yes?
I was sort of surprised to see the ZBrush come into the pipeline. I was wondering how much iteration is still involved at that phase, or is it mostly iterating the sketch phase and then possible ZBrush and then possible linearly on?
All right, so that question was how much iteration goes into ZBrush after I pretty much created that base model. So usually what I would do is I would knock out something pretty quickly because I'm pretty quick at it, I think, in general. And then I would just try to get the main shapes and silhouettes of those things out. Then I would pass things over to our art director, Alex, and then he would literally go, all right, I'm just going to scribble some extra shapes on top of that. And he would just do a couple quick paint overs. And then I would just pretty much go back and make a couple more iterations to that. But there was never really that many iterations once we've kind of got an idea of what we wanted from the original scribble and then the initial sculpt, and then there was just fine-tuning things to make sure we had the right sort of shape language that was pretty much intended for the creature. But I also had quite a lot of creative freedom on things as well, and then so it'll be like, oh yep, I wasn't expecting it to look like that, but I like that shape quite a bit. Let's just sharpen this edge up here. Let's do all this sort of stuff. So it worked out pretty smoothly. Yes?
In terms of your ZBrush approach, did you find that you approached it from more of a sketch and then refining later pipeline, or did you go with subdivisions kind of early?
Yeah, so usually, so that was what is my kind of approach to pretty much building up the kind of characters within ZBrush. So usually it would just be drop in all the random blocks and shapes that are roughly in the shape and size that I'm after, and then just roughly just get everything out, pretty much like that sketch sort of version. And then it's just I always tend to work at very low subdivisions until pretty much the last few minutes when I actually need to kind of sharpen edges down, or otherwise just dynamesh everything every now and then, I guess. But yeah, I just tend to do what kind of just works. It's very quick. I just sculpt really quick. I don't think we tried to spend more than probably a sprint on each character. It usually took me a few days at most to pretty much get the actual model pretty much modeled up in ZBrush, retopologized, and textured. And then most of the other time was just spent animating and getting it into the game, implementing it, and making it doing its thing. Cool. Yes?
You mentioned being aware of your time constraints. Did you have a particular production format you followed, sprints or something?
So what was kind of production sort of methodology, I guess, for our project? Yeah, so we use Agile, and we work within 2-week sprints. And then we always had a couple larger milestone deliverable dates that we're always working towards. But yeah, for the most part, we're always working with 2-week sprints. And we have recently switched to 4-day weeks, and then we've actually just switched that up to 3-week sprints at this point in time. That seems to be working out pretty well for us. But yeah, we've been working with that methodology for years and years that it's just become second nature to us, yeah.
And just also, how long did Dredge take?
All right, so how long did it take to create Dredge? So it was just around about 2 years exactly from conception till pretty much release to actually get things out. And now we're just spending a little bit of extra time just creating some extra content and DLC. Cool. Awesome. And then I'm getting told this tornado hand gesture, which I believe is we have to wrap things up. But if you want to kind of bug me after this, I will gladly answer any more questions with the walking around and stuff like that anyway. But thank you guys so much. It's been awesome. Thank you.